In this lecture, we'll talk about the manner in which the inhabitants of the princely states, which, as you know, occupied almost one third of the total territory of the subcontinent, became involved in the struggle for independence due to the forging of connections and links between the Congress and the state people's movements. Now, this forging of links between the Congress and the state people's movements acquires significance in the larger context of a deliberate imperial policy to insulate these princely states from the impact of modern ideas, the impact of Western education, influence of nationalism. We are all aware of how, in the course of the later half of the 19th century, the British reworked their relationship with the Indian princes in order to create the bulwark in their support, create enclaves of support in these princely states. As you know, over time, the situation began to change, especially after 1930s. The Congress became more responsive to the demands of the state peoples. As the state people movement began to gather strength, the Congress felt it necessary to respond more favorably to their overtures. But this was not the case in earlier times, when the Congress was actually reluctant to interfere in the princely states.
Excuse me, sir. Why were the early Congress leaders reluctant to become involved in the affairs of the princely state?
There are a number of reasons for this. Many liberal congressmen considered interference in the affairs of the princely states to be illegal. Princely states were looked upon as external territory. There was this reluctance. But this was not a very valid proposition, because many of these princely states were very closely connected with the rest of the British India. But more importantly, some of these congressmen, in fact, quite a number of them, looked upon some of these princely states as examples of enlightened despotism. You are all familiar with the manner in which the rulers of Baroda or the rulers of Travancore, to cite the two most prominent examples, undertook educational reforms, undertook political reforms, created in certain cases a modicum of representative government. So these examples of improving kingship in India impressed the nationalists with the idea that the Indians were capable of managing their affairs, contrary to what the British were arguing all the time, that they were incapable people, incapable of managing their own house. Secondly, the kind of initiatives that some of these rulers like Travancore or Baroda had taken towards political reform or economic change or economic development, development of the railways, were always cited as examples of some kind of enlightened autocracy. Lastly, they were primarily engaged in conducting an agitation against the British, and involvement of the state people's movement in their scheme of things would actually entail a greater amount of commitment, which the Congress leaders, perhaps in the age of mass nationalism, were reluctant to make, until changing political equations in the princely states made it imperative on the part of the Congress leaders to change their policies. In the meanwhile, the political equations in many of these princely states were changing, because there was an initiative from within the state peoples. We describe it as the state people's movements, but these state people's movements were articulated through various kinds of institutions that they had set up. There were Prajamandals or Lok Parishads in individual states, and these Prajamandals and the Lok Parishads were coming together in what was known as the All India State People's Conference. There were a number of conferences taking place. In 1927, for example, in Bombay, There was an all state people's conference of the Western Indian states. About a few months later, similar things were happening in the South Indian states, in Madras, almost coinciding with the Congress session in Madras. So in the Congress session, the resolution was taken about the need for a more positive policy towards the princely states, a more positive policy, yes?
Excuse me, sir. What was the nature of the political leadership in the princely states?
You mean the people who actually were leading the Prajamandals or setting up Lok Parishads and then coming together in these conferences, the All India State People's Conference or the South Indian State People's Conference. These were basically urban people. I mean, people who were residents of the major cities in the princely states, usually the capital towns. They went to educational institutions in British India and became familiar with the politics of associations, became familiar with the way different kinds of political bodies had emerged in British India, voicing different kinds of grievances. They were familiar with the manner in which the Indian National Congress had emerged as the hegemonic nationalist organization capable of taking on the power of imperialism. These were urban people, predominantly intellectuals or in members of the intelligentsia. Some were government functionaries as well. They were setting up initially these outfits. But as you know, they wanted to break the barrier as well. They were trying to reach out to the rural classes. We have many such examples of how people were trying to reach out to the rural classes in order to create a more powerful movement in these states. Let us just cite one example with which you are already familiar. A movement that started in Mewar, in a place called Bijolia, which is basically the entry point to Mewar through Malwa. And in Bijolia, there was a movement going on from 1916, in which the leadership came from a person called Vijay Singh Pathik. Now, this Vijay Singh Pathik was actually a revolutionary, a man from the United Provinces who became involved in the revolutionary movement and then decided to take refuge in Mewar. This was a very common thing among the revolutionaries who, in order to escape the British police, often took refuge in these princely states. Baroda was a very important sanctuary for many of the militant nationalist leaders during the height of the Swadesi movement. So Pathik, in collaboration with a small functionary of the Mewar state, namely Manikalal Verma, they had initiated a peasant movement in Bijolia in which the tribal peasants, the Bhils, were involved. These initiatives were happening, not although on a very large scale, in the princely states. And one of the major challenges for the political leadership in these princely states was to link up with these rural movements in order to strengthen their effort to set up Prajamandals. For example, in Mewar, the Prajamandal was set up much later in 1938 in the broader context of the emergence of a new kind of leadership which the Congress now was trying to prop up in the princely states. So, when you look at these examples of initiatives from within the princely states, we see how the movement, which had started mainly as an urban movement, but which through different stages tried to reach out to the rural people. And once they had been able to achieve that connection, the strength of the Prajamandal movement in the 1930s became more elaborate. That is one aspect of this change that we are talking about. The other important dimension concerns the negotiation with caste factors, because these caste factors or community or ethnic factors were also closely meshed with the rural mobilization that many of these political leaders in the princely states were undertaking. In this context, we may cite the example of Mysore, another very important princely state. James Maynard has written a very important book on Mysore in which he argues how the leadership of the Prajamandal, where this kind of an initiative dates back to 1917, remained with the urban people. And these urban people, largely Brahmins, had to wrestle with the Lingayats and the Vokkaliga elites in the rural areas. The Mysore state propped up these Vokkaliga and the Lingayat elite of the rural areas for some time. But in the course of the 1920s, however, the division between these two segments of political leadership was bridged, largely because of the initiative of the Mysore State Congress. The result was the emergence of a powerful movement in Mysore. And Gandhi also intervened in Mysore, but didn't allow the Satyagraha in the 1920s to continue for long. Gandhi also similarly intervened in Travancore. There was this famous Vaikam Satyagraha, which was centered around the demand for temple entry for the lower classes. We have Vallabhbhai Patel intervening in a Satyagraha at Baroda, in some of the regions which were adjacent to the British districts of Gujarat, which, as you know, were the Gandhian strongholds. We have some individual examples of congressmen becoming involved in these initiatives. But we don't come across, until the later part of the 1930s, any concerted move by the Congress as an organization to chart out a new strategy to associate the statespeoples, to associate these initiatives within the broader framework of the struggle for independence against the British.
Excuse me, sir. Why did the Congress suddenly decide to support these powerful movements in the princely states?
In the first place, the Congress felt that if it did not actually link up with these initiatives in the states, it would be taken over by their opponents, particularly the communists. Because the Congress Socialists and the communists had by then become active in many of the states, becoming associated with the agrarian movements in particular. So there was an urgency on the part of the Congress to forge connections. But there is an inside story as well. Because within the Congress, there were disagreements about the extent to which the Congress should become involved in the affairs of the princely states. Gandhi was in favor of a more cautious policy. Conservative congressmen had sympathy for the princely rulers. But by then, the Congress had also begun to change, because there was an initiative from within the Congress which came to be known as the Congress Socialist Party. People with communist beliefs, with socialist beliefs, continued to function within the Congress, but wanted to use the Congress in order to advance their more egalitarian and socialist ideas. Subhash Bose, for example, since the late 1920s remained a major exponent of intervention in the princely order. And Subhash Bose became the Congress president in Haripura Congress. And at Haripura, the resolution was taken by the Congress to adopt a more assertive strategy with regard to the state people's movement. So, those congressmen who actually were apprehensive of the success of the Congress left wing within the party wanted to take the wind out of their sail by endorsing certain individual interventions by important Congress leaders in the affairs of the princely states. So that would be roughly the explanation, that at one level, here was a movement which needed to be integrated into the Congress movement in order to strengthen the struggle against imperialism, and the princely order was always looked upon by the British Empire as one of the main support bases. It occupied a large territory. So, and secondly, there was an urgency on the part of men like Gandhi to undertake a more assertive strategy in order to prevent the Congress left wing from taking the initiative. And the result of this change in Congress policy was very significant because it energized the state people's movement. We come across from 1938 onwards a number of important movements and satyagrahas in the princely states, like Rajkot Satyagraha, Satyagraha in Baroda. We also come across greater involvement of the Congress leaders in their activities, the participation on a much larger scale of the men from the princely states in the Congress movements. Now, it is not as if that it is only from 1938 these trends were noticed. I have already suggested that there were examples of Congress involvement or the individual congressmen's involvement in the affairs of the princely states earlier also. And we also have many examples of how men from within the princely states participated in the civil disobedience campaign, in the non-cooperation movement. But all these individual examples were no match for the kind of organized initiative that we come across from 1938 onwards. Once the Congress shifted its ground and adopted a more assertive strategy. And the upshot of all this, these changes in Congress strategy, as we have indicated, was a series of movements in many parts of princely India. We have this famous Rajkot movement where the demand for democratization was raised apart from the demand for reduction of taxes. Gandhi intervened, but then Gandhi, as you know, because of his very cautious attitude, ultimately asked the leaders of the movement to withdraw the movement, to stop the movement. Roughly around the same time in Baroda, we see the involvement of Vallabhbhai Patel. But in fact, Vallabhbhai Patel became the leader of the Baroda Prajamandal movement, which in the same manner raised the demand for a representative assembly. But Patel, once again, seeing the failure of the Rajkot movement, decided to call off the agitation in the midpoint. You have a very significant transformation of political life in Rajasthan. We have already mentioned the Bijoliya Satyagraha. The Bijoliya Satyagraha didn't remain confined to this place alone. It spread into other areas of Mewar, and it actually unleashed new forces of politics in other parts of Rajputana where Prajamandals were set up. And invariably, these Prajamandals in Rajputana came up with similar demands about representative government, in which context some of the Rajput rulers began to contemplate the right kind of strategy to contain these movements. For example, Ganga Singh of Bikaner, in fact, asked the government at Jodhpur, the Marwar state, to conciliate Jainarayan Bas, who was a Prajamandal activist, on the ground that Vyas was an honest man. So you can see how the princely rulers in certain cases were trying to co-opt this movement, were trying to come to terms with this Prajamandal movement, especially when the Prajamandal movement became strengthened through the connections that they were able to forge with the Congress. The example of Ganga Singh, the ruler of Bikaner, advising his counterparts in Jodhpur to adopt a more conciliatory posture towards the Prajamandal movement there, suggests how in the relatively backward region of Rajasthan or Rajputana, a political transformation had already taken place. And this was not entirely the creation of the Congress or creation of the Congress involvement in the affairs of the princely states. One can actually explain this in terms of an earlier phase of activism in which urban leaders became involved in rural movements as well. The Kisan movement, leadership of the sort that Manikalal Verma in Mewar actually represented, who came to preside over the Mewar Prajamandal once it was formed in 1938, So you see the emergence of a new kind of leadership in most of these princely states, arising from the Prajamandal initiatives, whether in Gujarat states, in Kathiawar states, in places like Baroda, or in Orissa, for example. This was also the time in the later part of the 1930s when we come across regional leaders like Nabokrashna Chaudhary extended Congress influence into states like Dhenkanal and Talcher. So, in most parts of the princely India, we come across the emergence of a new kind of leadership which linked up with the Congress and became the foundation for the nationalist leadership which was set to take over power in 1947 once these states became integrated into the Indian Union. You have less palatable stories as well, where you can see the involvement of communal factors or ethnic conflicts in the politics of the Prajamandals in some of the states like Travancore or Alawar or Hyderabad, the most prominent example. You have ethnic factors like rivalries between different groups being used and exploited by the rulers.
Excuse me, sir. What would be the major examples of how the ethnic and communal elements influence the development of nationalism in the princely states?
You have many such examples. You have example of Alwar, for example, where the ruler, identifying himself with the Arya Samajist and the Hindu communalists, decided to persecute the Mios, Muslim group, predominantly peasants. You have the example of Travancore, where similar kinds of ethnic conflicts or caste conflicts had erupted. Even though in Travancore, the communists eventually managed to take over leadership of this movement. But the most important example, apart from the Sikh states of Patiala, Nava, where in the absence of a very concerted drive towards democratization, the state people's politics became very closely meshed with Akali demand for control of the Sikhs over the shrines. Ruler of Patiala emerges as a patron of the Akalis in their demand or in their desire to establish control over the shrines which the British didn't wish to accord to them. But the most prominent example would be Hyderabad, where the Hyderabad State Congress had been complaining about the Nizam's very deliberate policy of favoring the Muslims. Osmania University was accused of encouraging Islamic culture because of its policy to promote Urdu language. The Nizam was accused of persecuting Hindus, so the politics of the Prajamandal in this case, or the politics or people's initiatives in this case, became linked with the Arya Samajist effort to establish some kind of Hindu nationalist hegemony in this state. The Congress, of course, withdrew from the Hyderabad Satyagraha, which took place in 1938, but the contamination of the state people's movement in Hyderabad with certain elements of communalism associated with Arya Samajist activity, associated with their resentment about Nizam's deliberately pro-Muslim attitude, remains an important point to remember. But if we look at 1948, then the pro-Pakistan attitude of Nizam was a consequence of these phases of manipulations and conflicts of the late 1930s and early 1940s. And when the police action took place in 1948 to end the Razakar tyranny, it became easy for the Congress leadership to integrate Hyderabad into the Indian Union. Not through a movement of the kind that you come across in Rajasthan, but through a police action. So this police action of 1948 can be related to the politics in Hyderabad in the late 1930s and 1940s, where you can see a communal divide emerging. But overall, if one makes an assessment of the state people's movement, we see this as an important signal, an important indication of how the barriers were being broken with the coming together of a powerful thrust from the states, and they are combining with the Congress, setting the stage for the emergence of modern India, independent India, setting the stage for the Indian Union to integrate many of these princely states into the broader framework of united India.